I'd like to continue with our second session. I was asked by the organizers to convey once more the plea that people who are not interested in the Q&A session, please would they leave at the beginning of the session rather than in between, so that we can have an organized Q&A session for the time that we have. We will use the same format that we used in the previous session, 20 to 25 minutes for each speaker, and then in the remaining time we'll conduct lively discussions, I'm sure. We have three distinguished speakers in this session. And the session is titled, as you can see from the program, The Challenge of Sources and the Persistence of Myths. Our first speaker is Saleh Abdel-Jawad, who is an associate professor of political science in Birzeit University, where he has been teaching since the early 1980s. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with his important work on this notion of sociocide that characterizes the nature of the Israeli policies towards the Palestinian society in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And recently he wrote a very important work on the massacres of the 1948 war that you can find in a book that appeared in, I think, 2007, where and in other places where I think there's a very significant contribution to our understanding of what occurred in 1948 and the nature of the Israeli operation. So Saleh would be our first speaker, and he will speak about the credibility and limits of refugee oral testimonies, and I will introduce the other speakers as we go along with the panel. Please, Saleh.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I wish first to thank the organizers of this event, which I sincerely believe will be an exceptional one because of the quality of the participants and the choice of topics. A special thanks due to Naira Anton and to Roger Hickok for textual editing. The 1948 war was one of the most important events in the modern and contemporary Palestinian and Middle East history. Its consequences and impact go beyond the place, limit, and the historical time. The paradigm of the Nakba has since constantly fueled the collective memory of the Palestinians and became the main element of the Palestinian national identity. 1948 signaled the end of an era, the implementing of the first phase of the Zionist project, and established the basis of what to be. On the one hand, the continuous process to de-Arabize the land and to destroy the Palestinians, not only as a political entity, as most of the intellectuals and writers wrote, but as a society. And on the other hand, the continuous saga of resilience and resistance. 60 years later, the legitimacy of each side of the conflict depends to some extent on the way this exceptional tragedy is portrayed. That's why the historiography of the Nakba became a battlefield for two opposing narratives. The narrative of the colonial settler versus the dispossessed native. Michel Foucault understood this struggle over history between oppressor and oppressed. I quote, "There is a battle for history, over history, the will to codify, to strangle popular memory, and to impose on the people a framework to interpret the present." In the first stage of this battle, Zionists won. They have produced a comprehensive, coherent story which dominated the stage for many crucial decades. Arabs and Palestinians failed to produce a solid, comprehensive, and counter-narrative. In this gloomy picture, there shone a dim light, the serious, though non-comprehensive work of Palestinian historians and authors Walid Khaldi and Arif al-Arif. This failure is due to many reasons. First, writing history feeds on a combination of democratic regimes and societies, strong and open-spirited institutions, and critical individual mentalities. I argue that the near absence of this combination in the Arab world are more instrumental in silencing the voice of the Palestinian victims than the will saying that the victor writes history. One of the many reasons given for this failure is the destruction of the Palestinian written sources by the Zionists and the fact that they do not have a state of their own. This is true, but Egyptians, Syrians, Jordanians, and Iraqis who have a state and whose archives remained intact have not produced a single good book about 1948. In fact, Palestinian historians, despite all the difficulties, are far ahead of their Arab colleagues. The fact is that most work on the past lacked critical historiography and were based more on speculation and abstraction than empirical research. Also, we have to mention fragmentation and discord and multiplicity of the Arab narrative, which are a solid observation for decades. This fragmentation is not only motivated and drawn along national agendas, as Professor Abraham Saleh and Avi Schleim noted, but also within national stories on class and sectoral lines, i.e., military versus civilians, popular versus official. So when we take, for example, the Palestinian narrative, really we can classify three or categorize three narratives. The official narrative of the Mufti and his followers, but also the popular narrative taken especially through oral history, and the third one is the narrative of the middle class historians. And this case is the same in all Arab countries. In Jordan, the same. We will have the official narrative by Sadiq al-Shara, by Musa Sliman, but then you will have the other narrative, counter-narrative of the regime of Abdullah Ittal. Another aspect of this failure is the inability of some Arab and Palestinian historians to disentangle themselves from Israeli formulations and paradigms, even when they have unmasked the more mythical elements of the Israeli narrative. Like, for example, the Palestinians accept this Israeli paradigm that Palestinians during the 1948 were completely passive victims, only waiting just the arrival of the Israeli forces with their luggage and, and just to flee. There is also this paradigm about who began the war. Actually, the popular narrative and the Palestinian narrative accept the Israeli paradigm that Palestinians who began the war. I will develop this later. Over and beyond these problems, the lack of access to the kinds of documentary and archival sources from which corrective historical scholarship would ordinarily be drawn. 1948 was not only a case of sociocide or ethnic cleansing, but a case of culture-cide also. The Israeli victory had a direct impact on the capacity of Palestinians to write their own narrative. As Benedict Anderson wrote, nations accumulate memory through printed word. And for Palestinians, most of their printed word disappeared with the war. To overcome the destruction of written Palestinian sources and the fact that oral traditions have always been deeply embedded as the main tool of collective memory, Palestinian historians began, though late, to use refugee testimonies to recover control of their own narrative. Oral testimony, here I will discuss the credibility of oral testimonies. Oral testimonies are well-established data source, having proved their value by traditional criteria when applying academic rigor. In the Jewish tradition, there is a heavy dependence on oral testimonies to write the tragic and painful Holocaust. But in the contested case of Palestinian historiography, and within the double standard attitude, Israeli historians denied for decades the validity of Palestinian testimonies. Unfortunately, this position was shared until recently by many Palestinian positivist historians. The old Chinese saying that one stroke of a pen is better than 1,000 memories speaks partially to this hesitation. And their concerns are not entirely baseless, for as important as oral histories are, they are in many ways inherently troublesome. Memory can be unreliable, and the capacity to recall details may fade or be distorted, especially after the passage of many years. Interviewers may also be biased in their questions, clearly preferring one answer to another and thereby distorting the record. When the imperfect process of recall is further embedded in a highly ideologized context, the credibility of oral testimonies may be even more problematic. And I have to admit here that written sources, documents, is the most prominent in this trend, which began, and I have to admit that written sources, including Israeli documents, were sometimes more accurate, for example, about dates, times, and battle strategy that could not be retried through oral histories. In fact, written sources also suffer, written sources also suffer from biases and falsifications, although not identical to these of oral history. Testimonies of Nakba survivors become, by default, an absolute necessity and an important strategy for retrieving lost Palestinian data. Whether historians rely on oral or written sources, the real issue is the accuracy and the credibility of their material. Michael Balambo, speaking of Palestinian oral narratives, captures both the hesitation and the affirmation of oral sources. He says, after giving many examples, I'm quoting him, "Clearly, the testimony of Arab refugees must be used with great care. Initially, I decided not to use the memories of Palestinian survivors of 1948, but I soon realized that their testimony was verified by non-Arab sources. On other occasions, I found that the refugee estimates of casualties in Zionist atrocities was lower than those of the US and other neutral observers, who in some cases counted the bodies of the victims." So Palestinians began to use oral sources as early as but partially as mid-50s. Many historians ignore that Arif al-Arif, who began to write in 1956, depended heavily on oral sources. Both his work and Nafid Nazzal's oral history work on the Palestinian exodus from Galilee were confirmed many years later by declassified Israeli documents. Efrat bin Zeev, an Israeli researcher who studied 3 Palestinian villages, Jaba' Ijzim Ain Ghazal, arrived to the conclusion that there is no contradiction between the testimonies of the villagers and the information in the Israeli archives. Ilah Harshavi conducted oral history in the village of Diwaime in 1948, and her work likewise was later confirmed by the Israeli documents. Birzeit Research Center published data in 2 massacres, Tiret Haifa and Abu Shusha, in early 1994. At the time of the publication, Israeli historians remained completely silent. In 2004, Penny Morris confirmed the massacre of Abu Shusha, and why Palestinian claimed a total of 50 people, Morris put the death toll at 70. As for Tiret Haifa, Morris confirms the presence of burned bodies consistent with the oral testimonies, though the Israeli army continues until today to dispute the interpretation of the presence of these burnt bodies. But if oral testimonies often converge with documentary evidence, the question arises, what do oral testimonies add to the record? Ronald Fraser, the author of a major oral history of the Spanish Civil War, answers the question. It is what people feel, and what people feel lays the ground for their actions. French historian Henry Lawrence says about Palestinian testimonies, for the first time, the voice of the victims makes itself heard. History becomes embedded with a soul, with a flesh and blood. The history of the Zionist terror that was suffered has become known. In short, despite their initial disclaimers, even Israeli historians have begun to acknowledge implicitly the validity and value of Palestinian oral testimonies. Despite this credibility, many problems remain. One of these is that until now, oral testimonies were used to write some facts, but not to rewrite the historiography of the Nakba. One of the exceptions, and it hopefully points the way to future research, is my work about the massacre as a collective phenomenon, and not as a succession of individual tragedies. Hundreds of works are now based on oral history, but many of these were not done by specialists or historians. Susan Slimovich names these memorial books. In these works, many are anti-historic. Rochelle Davies published a work in memorial volumes of the destroyed Palestinian villages, and while Davies sympathized with the refugees in their attempt to recreate their lost home, the national and the individual, she uncovers the idyllic inscribed in these works, questioning their validity as historical documents. I would refer people on this question to my article, درة الغواص في أوهام أهل الخواص. The translation is the pearl of the diver. It's a critical essay concerning published works on the Nakba and destroyed villages based on oral sources. Through 500 interviews which I conducted, I realized that the Zionist myth of the Arab orders theory remains in the mind of many refugees. And also, when it comes to why the Palestinians fled, there are two paradigms which I derived from old refugee testimonies. One is the paradigm of flight, meaning that they left without reason. The other is the paradigm of the expulsion, meaning that they were forced to leave, especially after a massacre. This is so dangerous because it indicates a cleavage in the collective memory, and we have to deal with it. Before ending my presentation, I wish to say that there is much left to do, and mainly, we need a revolution. We have to answer despite all the late achievements. Nur Masalha about the concept of the transfer. Walid al-Khalidi about Deir Yassin and the destroyed villages. Mustafa Abbasi about Safad. May Sekhali about Haifa. Adil Manna about Majd al-Krum. And many others. We have excellent Palestinian works in the last 10 years. But we have to answer the question, what are the structural reasons behind the fact that only too late did we begin to deal with oral history? Also, what happened to the Beirut Research Center archives and the Arab Studies Association in Jerusalem? Why is teaching Palestinian history still handicapped in our universities? I will have some answers, but I will leave them to the question period. I would conclude with this, quoting Benjamin Bet-Halehmi. In struggling to write their own history, Palestinians are attesting to the importance of quality. In this gallant insistence, they, after 1948, and following a total defeat and quasi-total disintegration, the Zionist dream called for the natives to leave the stage of history and disappear. They were expected to vanish into oblivion. Instead, they have refused to disappear quietly, and they became the spoilers. And I personally would add that despite their weakness, they have been, as the last war on Gaza shows, an important party to the events in the Middle East. From total unknown, they had become an entity about whom the whole world was concerned. The goal of the Palestinians since 1960s was to put themselves back on the stage of history, and they succeeded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saleh. Our next speaker is Isabelle Humphries, who would need to use, I think, the projector. And she will talk about challenging myth among the stones of the Galilee. Isabelle is completing, if I understand correctly, her DPhil dissertation. A doctoral dissertation on grassroots politics of Palestinian internal refugees at St. Mary's University College. She contributed to various collections, and she's also been very active in various NGOs that work on the ground. And I'm sure this is just the beginning of a very successful and prosperous career. Isabelle, please.
Thank you. Okay, I don't know if you can see this at the back. I'm really sorry, but if you can't see, I don't know if maybe it helps if these lights go. Leave them on, it's okay? Okay. All right, if you can't see them, it doesn't spoil the presentation because I designed it so that if there was a disaster. Okay? All right. So what I've called my presentation is Challenging Myth Among the Stones of the Galilee. On the same day that Mahmoud Darwish was honoured at a formal funeral in Ramallah, a small group of mourners gathered by an Israeli gas station off the road to Akka. Carrying sheaves of wheat and Palestinian flags, they slowly followed a coffin carried along a winding track up the Galilee hillside. Oh, sorry. I first visited the cemetery of Al-Biawi, perched overlooking the plain of Akka, in summer 2005. 3 villagers had taken me there. 2 who remembered life in a village paradise, and a third born in the 50s in a village less than 3 miles away, in the shacks where his parents were sheltering. These internal refugees, sometimes called internally displaced, but I use the term internal refugees, like Darwish's family, have Israeli passports, yet are no more able to return home in death than those who fled to Lebanon. The cemetery is one of Beerwee's few surviving landmarks. The extensive land of the village is now divided between Kibbutz Yazor and Moshav Ahihud. The coffin, followed by several hundred mourners that August afternoon, was empty. Looking at the programme before this conference, I assumed we would have already been discussing the nature of historical sources and oral history. So what I wanted to do today is to reflect on one thing that could broadly be called a source, in the broadest sense of the word. It's something that only Palestinians inside Israel have access to currently with the closure from the West Bank and Gaza, and that's the land itself. I'm going to use the term Palestinians inside Israel. When I say that, it's not, and I want to make this point clear at the moment, I'm not separating this off as a group that's separate from the rest of the Palestinian body. From the empty fields where villages once stood, to restaurants and art galleries created in mosques that still stand, this one in Safad, Palestinians inside Israel are daily confronted with the Zionist historical narrative. I assume that those of you who haven't visited yourselves have seen in photos like this in books like Professor Helidy's All That Remains. Sharif Kanana, Ted Swedenberg, and many others have shown how the Israeli narrative is reproduced at multiple levels in the Israeli societies in which Palestinians live. From the commemorative days of the calendar, which as Israeli citizens they have to follow, to the school curriculum, and most powerfully, inscribed on the land itself. I'm going to use two examples from 2008, the 60th anniversary of the Nakba, and in this presentation, look at how the land itself is used as a source to challenge the persistence of Zionist mythology. Of 1 million Palestinians inside Israel, there are around a quarter who are from refugee families, those who sheltered in areas later occupied by Israel and becoming Israeli citizens. During 2 decades of military rule following the Nakba, of which we're going to hear more tomorrow, a variety of laws prevented refugees from even visiting, let alone returning to live. This is Sofmata in the very north. This is Kufr Birim. And this is a small village, Al-Naha, near Akka. I took these photos, but there's a few in here that were given me by friends. Houses, mosques, and churches were blown up or left to ruin, and kibbutzes, moshavs, towns and military areas built over them. This also Sofmata. This one's Rabsiya. If you can see, some of you will be able to see the 3 layers of razor wire. That's a lot nastier than barbed wire. And this in Al-Bassa. On one day a year, ironically the day that Israelis celebrate independence, and you can see them all picnicking everywhere on their land, Palestinians were actually allowed to cross over barriers and visit whatever remained of their homes on that one day of the year. The rest of the time during military rule, that was totally out of access for them. Activism at the site of destroyed villages began to develop in the mid-80s alongside wider changes in Palestinian politics. Members of older generations began to form village-based committees to reinforce and reproduce destroyed village identity among generations born in exile. Specifically, they worked to try to preserve remains like this and to gain access to graveyards and holy sites. In the early 90s, as Palestinians inside Israel realized they'd be that they would be excluded from international negotiations, otherwise known as the peace process, as we talked about before, committees joined together to form one umbrella organisation, which is called the Association for the Defence of the Rights of the Internally Displaced, or ADRID. While all Palestinians inside Israel were seen in the Oslo process as a domestic Israeli issue not for international concern, internal refugees felt doubly marginalised, fearing a compromise would be made which signed away their claims in return for a small fraction of historic Palestine. This is in Lejeune, in the central area. Building on the tradition of visiting villages on the same day Israelis commemorate independence, ADRID established 10 years ago an annual Nakba March, encouraging Palestinians to gather at one specific village. The event follows a set format, a walk from the main road to a clearing in woods or fields where seats are laid out. Marchers carry placards with the names of destroyed villages and Palestinian flags. Central to proceedings are speeches by a village elder recalling the Nakba, followed by a child who asserts that the new generation knows what happened in this place, knows that they have a right to return, and promises to keep the history alive. In 2008, ADRID chose the site of Surrey for the 60th anniversary march. In 1948, Surrey was one of the largest villages in the Galilee, with 4,500 inhabitants. For any of you who know numbers at that time, that was a very big village. Today, the hill of Surrey is covered with a pine forest planted by the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. Israeli Surrey is now one of several Jewish settlements on the land. A sign welcomes tourists to visit the mosaics at the historic Roman site. If you pay your money to go inside there, whether you're a foreigner or a Palestinian or an Israeli, this is one of the things you can see. This is a tomb. One of the graveyards is inside the tourist site, and the people in Nazareth who are trying to campaign for it haven't been given access to clean this particular cemetery. While many Surrey refugees are located in Lebanon and beyond, a significant number remained within a few miles of their original homes. This is another thing they would have seen. This is a sign which you won't be able to see from here, but it's a JNF sign in the forest. And bizarrely, if we're talking about history, this talks about celebrating Guatemalan independence in 1821.
Oh, well.
So that's Surrey. The Nazareth neighbourhood named Safafri developed on the northern edge of town, and that's still predominantly lived in by Surrey refugees. Many of them can actually see their former lands from the windows. This march was attended by a group of about 15,000, including children and elderly. It's a very kind of family kind of event. People go in the forest, families from that village, families from other villages, and plenty of people who are just, who want to come and express solidarity. As the event closed, demonstrators made their way to their cars at the end of the march. And at the end of the march, they found a counter-demonstration of Jewish Israelis on the main road close to the scheduled end of the march. I apologise, I haven't got photos. I did actually live there mostly for 7 years, and about a month before the 60th anniversary, I didn't get a new visa, so I haven't got any photos there. So while police are always visible at these events, until 2008, there'd not been a big confrontation. The route has to be coordinated with the police beforehand, otherwise it wouldn't even start. I mean, it would be ended before it began. So the police deliberately decided to allow the counter-demonstration, sorry about it shaking, the counter-demonstration to happen. As verbal clashes erupted, police positioned themselves facing the Palestinian crowd. As the bulk of Palestinians turned to head back up the hill. Police attacked, injuring dozens with clubs, tear gas and stun grenades. And I guess there might be people here who were actually there who could explain that better than I could. There was a lot of footage on YouTube. It's still there if you want to go and find it. You've got pictures of police kicking people on the ground, stamping on people, chasing, deliberately smashing cameras and video equipment, including, I think there's one of him, of a police person kicking the CNN reporter is one of them on there. So that's Surrey. Now the other case I talked about before from this year is in Al-Birwi. The symbolic funeral for Mahmoud Darwish was held 4 months after the march that was in April. Driven from Al-Birwi at the age of 7, he became an internal refugee living in villages only a few miles away. As the mourners reached the top of the hill, only a few gravestones, cacti and pomegranate trees like this one where someone's put some posters were there to greet them. Around the empty coffin, people read from his poetry and stood in silence listening to the sound of the oud. A eulogy was delivered by the poet Hanna Abu Hanna, a comrade of Darwish's before his permanent exile from the Galilee in 71. People covered the coffin with wheat, flowers and olive branches, lighting candles at the foot of the grave. Four years ago, after interviewing 3 men about their childhood memories of Al-Birwi, they suggested we went to the land of the village. They told me they'd negotiated with Israeli authorities the right to visit one of the cemeteries, in fact this cemetery that we went to. After half an hour wandering quietly in the graves, we were about to leave, but we were approached by one of the Moshav farmers, shouting aggressively and demanding that we leave at once. I do actually have a photo of him. The Israeli farmer, with his property and cowsheds bordering the cemetery and covering the site of the destroyed church, is well known to the Birwi villagers. This was not their first encounter with him. We were in fact leaving, but the moment he attempted to force us to go, the Birwi villagers chose to stand their ground. In response, the Israeli bolted his gate across the road, prevented us from driving away and called the police to arrest us. Knowing theoretically the law was on our side, we too called the police to release us. After 1 hour, a lone police officer arrived, opened the gate without issuing our captor any penalties or fines. I wondered how long it would take and how many armed police would arrive if a Palestinian locked Jewish Israelis in a cemetery. Palestinians experience Israeli society becoming less, not more, tolerant, and we talked about that already. Village commemoration over 15 years has not resulted in significant change to the framework of media, educational or political discourse. In 2008, police assaulted demonstrators at Surrey. An Islamic association in September, the organisation which is involved with organising work camps to clean destroyed cemeteries, has been declared illegal, and Nakba 60 events were regularly denounced by media and politicians as anti-peace or proving Palestinian citizens' disloyalty to the state that was so kind to them. With this presentation then, I'm not suggesting that this kind of activity is going to deconstruct narrative in the Israeli mainstream. That doesn't mean that individual Israelis don't see it that way, but in the mainstream, it's not going to affect that. As Ahmed Saadi, Nadim Rahana, and others have written, Israel is a state which is founded to serve the needs of one ethnic group only. Commemorating villages in Israeli public space questions a historical narrative of a land for one people only. Israelis who actually took this challenge seriously would not need to just adjust some policy towards Arab citizens, but this history demands that they totally reassess their view of the state, a state which by nature excludes the Palestinian other. If accepted, this discourse doesn't simply lead to mild revisions. As I said, the inevitable conclusions are ones which mean that few Israelis are prepared to look Palestinian history in the face. Commemorative activity, however, makes a significant contribution to the way the community reflects on history and on the Zionist framework with which they interact daily. The impact of 60 years in which Palestinian history has been marginalized and replaced within the school curriculum, media, and landscape cannot be underestimated. As Ismail Abu Saad argues in relation to school curriculum, it's designed to de-educate or dispossess Palestinians of the knowledge of their own people and history, giving only carefully screened and censored access, suppressing any aspects contradicting the Zionist narrative. Village-based action raises awareness of the importance of preserving historical knowledge, knowledge central to building political resistance. I'm about to finish here. After the Safori event, a high school student that I had taught in Nazareth, an 18-year-old, wrote to me. It had been her first demonstration. She described her terror and disorientation as she saw the armed police on horseback careering towards her as tear gas and sound bombs echoed around. This was the first time I had truly understood what it meant to be Palestinian, she said. It meant not to have the freedom to commemorate your loss, to be obliged to endure endless racism and violence, to be blamed for people's wrongdoing on you, to have all your rights and truths overruled, to have no say. I can now finally understand an ounce of what my grandparents endured. Using examples from two of many villages, today I've tried to illustrate Palestinian use of land as a witness to history, a form of history-telling by a people without a substantial written archive. Reshaping and labeling the landscape is a primary way in which Israel perpetuates its own narrative. Palestinian commemoration not only serves as a way of reproducing and creating community history, but it's a direct challenge to the inscription of an Israeli narrative so integral to continuing oppression.
Yeah. Well, I know Norman Finkelstein's biography by heart, so we can do it in the dark. But we would like to see him. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for your talk. Our next speaker, as I said, I'm sure doesn't need much of an introduction. Norman has received his doctorate from Princeton University in 1988, and I think many of us, if not all of us, are familiar with the 5 books that he has published. We are all looking forward to his new book that should come out soon, I hope, A Farewell to Israel, the coming breakup of American Zionism, which is scheduled for spring 2009. Norman is going to take us a little bit out of the 1948 issue and focus on the June 1967 war in a lecture titled What Bestsellers Proclaim, What Scholarship and Documentary Record Show. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I decided not to speak on the 1948 war because I think the record is fairly well known. At least the recent findings are fairly widely known, whereas the one aspect of the Israel-Palestine conflict where the myths remain very persistent are the myths surrounding the June 1967 war. Before looking at that, it's worth reflecting for a moment on why those myths have persisted and the ones around 1948, at any rate in scholarship, have been largely dispelled. And I think the reason is basically a political one. namely the issues raised by the political issues raised by the 1948 war have largely been settled apart from the refugee question, whereas the issues raised by the June 1967 war, primarily the occupation, they remain live political issues. And because the 48 questions, apart from the refugee question, have been largely settled, there is, especially among Israelis, a willingness to explore what actually happened. The former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami, I think it was in his book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, I could be mistaken, but I think it was there. He said the main outcome of the June 1967 war, its main outcome was to legitimate the borders of the 1949 war. And I think that's an important observation, that once, or the main outcome having been to legitimate what happened in 1948, apart from the refugee question, there was now an ability or a willingness to explore what actually happened. Basically, what I think Ben-Ami had in mind was, in the debates that ensued after the June 1967 war, first in the General Assembly, the Fifth Emergency Session, and then in the Security Council, by the end of those debates, it was accepted in the international community that a resolution of the conflict was dependent upon two factors. Number one, the full Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in June 1967. That was the responsibility of Israel, and the responsibility on the side of the Arab states was to recognize Israel's borders that it established in 1949. So in my view, the main reason the myths persist about the 67 war is because there is a real political stake in what that record actually shows. It's not really a lack of sources. Already soon after the June 67 war, one was able to get a fairly clear picture of what happened. Not exact, obviously, because it wasn't archival material, but you had the memoirs of people like Utant, Audible, and others who are active. And now you can judge from the publications which have recently come out by people like Tom Segev, a very good book by this Israeli historian, Ami Gluska. You could see there's archival material available as well. And then you have on the American side, it took a long time, but they finally released the volume on the June 67 war, the Foreign Relations of U.S. volume. It's a very fat volume, extremely informative. So you have the material available, but still, notwithstanding the availability of the material, most of what was said in June 67 about Israel, you can call it the Abba Eban version of history. Most of that version of history still endures. Very little of it has been challenged. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is to go through what actually happened in June 1967, which culminated in the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, and the Sinai, what actually happened, and then to look at why Israel went to war in June 67. It's not only of historical interest, but I think the main reason it went to war was basically why it also attacked Gaza a couple of months ago. It's pretty close, though there are some distinctions which are worth looking at. So how does this June 67 war begin, which ends with the occupation? It actually didn't begin with the Palestinians, and it didn't begin with Egypt. It all really begins with Syria, there were conflicts between Syria and Israel over what were called the demilitarized zones between Syria and Israel that formed after the June 67 war. The conflicts, there's no real dispute about what was happening. Israel was engaging in a land grab, trying to seize control over the demilitarized zones. And in a famous interview, which was published long after his death, Moshe Dayan acknowledged, he said, at minimum, 80% of the clashes between Israel and Syria were caused by Israel. Israel would go in with a tractor, knowing full well the tractors were going to evoke a Syrian response, and then they would come in with their airplanes. And that's exactly what happened in the final incident, which brought on the hostilities in June 67. In April 1967, there's another incident in the demilitarized zone. The incident quickly escalates into an aerial battle between the Israelis and the Syrians. And in the course of the aerial battle, several Syrian planes are downed by Israel, one or two over Damascus. At this point, the Israelis begin to threaten that Syria is getting out of hand, Syria is too radical, and that Syria needs to be put in its place. In early May 1967, the Israeli cabinet takes a decision that it's going to attack Syria if Syria doesn't desist from its provocations. And then Israeli officials in early May begin to make statements publicly that we're going to attack Syria. At this point is really where the official Israeli history usually begins. And most of you are familiar with that official Israeli history. It begins with the famous claim that the Soviet Union had misled the Egyptians and misled the Syrians by passing on a message that Israel was going to attack Syria. And so most of the historiography begins with this question, this perplexing question. Why did the Soviets pass on this obviously false message that Israel was going to attack? How many of you are familiar with that? I'm just curious in the audience. Not that many, I'm surprised. That's the standard claim. Well, it's an interesting point of departure because the reason Soviets passed on that message was because Israel was going to attack. And I was actually quite surprised. I opened up recently a new book by an Israeli historian. He's very mainstream, and he frankly acknowledges, the historian's name is Ami Gluska, G-L-U-S-K. He writes a book on the June 67 war. I picked it up and expected it was going to just be trash. And then I was actually rather surprised to read these words. He says, quote, "The Soviet assessment from mid-May 1967 that Israel was about to strike at Syria was correct and well-founded. Soviet intelligence sources must have been aware of this fact." And it happens that after the June 67 war, when the General Assembly met, Kosygin, who was then representing the Soviet Union, he says, we know exactly from a cabinet meeting, I think he said May 9th or May 13th, we know exactly they took that decision. And he was exactly right. There was no mystery why the Soviets passed on that message. They passed it on because that's what Israel intended to do. They got the size of the attack probably wrong, or you could say definitely wrong. The scope of it, they overestimated or overblew, but the fact that it was imminent was certain. At this point, President Nasser of Egypt, he was in a dilemma, because when Israel attacked the West Bank in November 1966, the raid in the village of Samu, he did nothing. So the Jordanians were saying that Egypt is, or Nasser is all words and no action. Then April 1967, when Israel downs the Syrian plains, he also does nothing. And now he's faced with the prospect of an Israeli attack, and he feels the necessity to do something. And what he does, most of you are familiar with. At this point, he asks the United Nations Emergency Force, which had been stationed between the Egyptian and Israeli border in 1957, he asks for it to be removed, both from the Sinai, and it seems he was misunderstood here, but it's also removed from Sharm el-Sheikh. Israel says, well, this was obviously a threat to its existence, the removal of the United Nations Emergency Force, but in fact it obviously was not, because Israel always had the option of simply telling the United Nations, restation the emergency force on our side of the border. And Israel rejected that option. And when you read the literature on the topic, they always try to make excuses about why they rejected the option. Exactly why they did, it's not entirely clear. But what is clear is that people like Secretary General Utant of the United Nations and Ad Bull, a strange name, Ad Bull, they both said, had Israel agreed to restation the United Nations Emergency Force on their side of the border, it probably could have avoided the war. Be that as it may, at this point, things begin to fairly rapidly escalate, or they appear to escalate. Nasser moves troops into the Sinai, and then later, around the third week in May, he declares that the Straits of Tiran have been closed and that there is a blockade. Now, how many people are familiar with that, the closing of the Straits of Tiran? Okay, so now we're getting to more familiar history. But what's little known about that is it actually never happened. Nasser declared a blockade of the Straits of Tiran. In fact, it was not a significant blockade. About 5% of Israeli goods passed through the straits to the port city of Eilat. 50% of the oil did go through there, that's true. But Israel at that point had ample reserves of oil for at least 4 months. The more important thing is, within a few days, Nasser just let the ships pass. There was no blockade of the Straits of Tiran after about 3 or 4 days. There's a good book written by a fellow who was in one of the UN forces there. His name was Refugee. It's called The Sinai Blunder. And he sort of laughingly says that he went to the Straits. There are a couple of little islands there. And he says there was no blockade. Israel was completely aware of this, and during the negotiations that were going on at the time, they acknowledged that the blockade, or the issue of the blockade, was not crucial, and it was a secondary issue for them. Give me 1/2 second. 3, 1, 3, okay. At this point, Utant, the Secretary General, he tries very hard to diffuse the situation, and he says, let's do what was done with the blockade of Cuba. Namely, let's have a moratorium, and let's just keep things in place and avoid any escalation of hostilities. The Egyptians said, fine. Nasser said, okay. Then Utant said, let's appoint a special envoy to try to negotiate a resolution. Again, Nasser said, okay. But on both of those proposals, the moratorium and the special envoy, Israel said no. At this point, the US came into the act, and at the end of May and early June, they started to carry on negotiations. And finally, the Egyptian vice president was scheduled to come to the United States in the first week of May to try to find a diplomatic solution. Excuse me, the first week in June. But 2 days before he came to the United States, Israel attacked. It's interesting to point out that a lot of what I've just told you, you can find in official Israeli accounts of the war coming out soon after the June '67 war. So I don't know if it's still around, but it was called the Middle East Record, which was a compilation, a semi-official compilation that Israel put out every year. And they write the following. This was about 1968. They say, quote, there are a number of facts which seem to indicate President Nasser believed in the possibility of terminating the conflict through diplomacy. For example, he called for the World Court to arbitrate the issue of the Straits of Tiran, and he was vague about the enforcement of the blockade. If you open up to a very recent, excellent book by Ze'ev Ma'oz called Defending the Holy Land, he concludes, and I'm quoting him, up to the outbreak of the war, Nasser was interested in finding a ladder to climb down from the tall tree he found himself. Well, the obvious question then arises, if a diplomatic resolution seemed to be within grasp, why did Israel attack in June 1967? Most of you know the familiar answer as it's put in the famous chapter in Abba Eben's memoir. He called it, referring to the June '67 war, to live or to die. Namely, Israel's survival was at stake. There was this imminent attack, and Israel had to preempt the imminent attack. Well, what does the record show about that? There, the record is very clear, because Israel needed the green light, or some say the yellow light, from the United States before it attacked Egypt in 1967. So they were sending lots of emissaries to the United States and trying to convince the Americans that we're on the verge of a catastrophic attack, we have to preempt. And they supplied the Americans with all of this intelligence data. President Johnson at the time, he took all of this data and he gave it to all of the American intelligence agencies, of which about 6 went through them. They're all processing the data, and they all come back with 2 conclusions. They all agree on 2 things. Number 1, Egypt is not going to attack. All our data show, using your information, that they're not going to attack. And number 2, if they do attack, and even if they attack with Jordan and with Syria, even if it's a multi-front attack, even if against all probabilities they attack, all our data show, in the famous line by Lyndon Johnson, that you'll whip the hell out of them. Well, that was the American conclusion. what was the Israeli conclusion. And here it's quite interesting. If you look at that big fat volume from the Foreign Relations of the U.S., I found one sentence particularly illuminating. The head of the Israeli Mossad at the time, Major General Meir Amit, he comes to Washington on June 1st. He's trying to convince the Americans, we have to attack. And he says, and now I'm quoting, "There is no difference between the U.S. and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture or its interpretation," which means the Israelis agree. Egypt's not going to attack, and if it does, Israel will whip the hell out of them. If you look at the standard historiography now, that's basically the consensus picture. So I'll quote the most recent book by Tom Segev on the '67 war. And he says, it is doubtful whether Eshkol, Levi Eshkol was the prime minister then, it is doubtful whether Eshkol believed that Israel's existence was truly in danger, and it's equally doubtful that he was convinced Egypt would attack. He knew what the Israeli army knew, that even if Egypt had attacked, Israel would win. So we can set aside the standard propagandistic claim that Israel launched its preemptive attack because of its fear of an Egyptian attack. Then what does that leave us with? It leaves us, I think, with basically two explanations. The secondary one, not the primary one, the secondary one is what Israelis called back then the miraculous second chance. That is to say, the second chance to get its borders correct. And from the early or mid-1960s, the Israeli generals were talking about expanding the Israeli borders and acquiring the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. I won't go through that in detail. It's quite copiously documented in Segev's book, and I think that's what makes his book particularly useful. What's interesting for our purposes is many of you have perhaps heard the famous Israeli claim, we didn't want the West Bank. In fact, we called King Hussein and told him, don't attack, because if you do, then we'll have to go in. How many people have heard that famous line? Okay, not that many. But the fact of the matter is, Segev quotes Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli general at the time, as saying right after Nasser announced his blockade, he says, quote, this is Rabin, let's be honest with ourselves. First we will attack Egypt, then we will also attack Syria and Jordan, regardless of what Jordan or King Hussein did. At the end of May, the IDF officer staff, they prepared, and now I'm quoting Segev again, to attack and then occupy the West Bank and to shift its priorities from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to Egypt, Jordan, Syria. And again, quoting Segev, none of the generals assumed that the IDF would wait for a Jordanian attack. So regardless of whether King Hussein launched hostilities or not, the Israelis intended to attack and take over the West Bank. But that, as I said, to my thinking, looking at the record, that was the secondary purpose of the attack. The primary purpose of the attack, and it comes across very clearly when you read the internal record, the primary purpose was for Israel to restore what it called its deterrence capacity. And that phrase keeps coming up. The Israelis were upset, first of all, because the Syrians were out of hand. And then come the third week in May, Nasser announces, he was a blowhard, it wasn't true, but he announces the closing of the Straits of Tiran. And now he's whipping up the hysteria of the Arab masses, and the Arabs have got this idea in their heads that they don't have to follow Israeli orders. And this upset Israel very much. Its deterrence capacity was being undermined. Or as then Divisional Commander Ariel Sharon put it, he says, Israel is losing its deterrent capability, our main weapon, the fear of us. That was the big problem in June 1967 or May 67. The Arabs were now, or seemed to be taking initiatives such that they weren't fearful of Israel, and they needed to be cut down to size. The fellow I mentioned earlier, Ze'ev Ma'oz, he doesn't deny there was a diplomatic solution possible, but he says as follows: to respond diplomatically to this crisis would kill Israel's deterrence. Even if diplomacy succeeded in diffusing the crisis and returning the status quo. That was the problem. Diplomacy means you have to meet your opponent, you have to deal with your opponent more or less as equals. And it no longer means that you simply dictate and your opponent follows orders. So even though a diplomatic resolution was within grasp, even if diplomacy succeeded in diffusing the crisis and returning to the status quo, Israel didn't want it because it saw any diplomatic resolution as undermining its deterrence capacity, so long as you understand what deterrence capacity means. It means, to quote Sharon, the fear of us. And that's basically what happened, I think, during the recent massacre in Gaza. Namely, in May 2000, the Hezbollah succeeds in expelling Israel from South Lebanon. It creates a certain amount of euphoria in the Arab world. Israel is worried. Its deterrence capacity has been undermined. It prepares for another attack on Hezbollah. In the summer of 2006, it finds its pretext, not worth going into now. It goes after the Hezbollah, suffers an even greater or more ignominious defeat. Its deterrence capacity has suffered again. Then in mid-2008, Israel's trying to conscript the United States for an attack on Iran. The sometime historian and full-time propagandist Benny Morris is going around and saying that if the United States doesn't attack with conventional weapons, Israel is going to have to go into Iran with unconventional weapons. Well, the United States vetoes the idea, and of course Israel couldn't possibly act without US acquiescence, the green light or the yellow light, and Iran goes its merry way. And so Israel's deterrence capacity drops another notch. And at this point, Israel can only restore its deterrence capacity because it doesn't have a military option against Hezbollah. It doesn't have a military option against Iran. The only way it could restore its deterrence capacity is to go into Gaza. And I'll leave it there, except to point out one crucial difference between 67 and what happened in Gaza. Both were about deterrence capacity. But the crucial difference is, in 1967, Israel restored its deterrence capacity by inflicting a military defeat on the Arab states. In 2008 and 9, its option of inflicting a military defeat, a defeat on the battlefield, was not there. It couldn't do it against Hezbollah, or it would have tried again. It couldn't do it against Iran. And so its strategy underwent a revision. To restore its deterrence capacity, it no longer sought a military defeat, but it sought to wreak as much devastation on the civilian population and civilian infrastructure so as to restore the fear of Israel. And so, as Anthony Kordsman puts it in a disgusting study called The Gaza War, he says Israel's aim was to convey to the Arab world that Israel is, and I'm quoting him, Israel is crazy, that if you mess with us, we'll just annihilate you. And that tells you something, I think, about the nature of how the conflict has somewhat changed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman. According to the plan, we actually should have now a break, but we started 15 minutes late. I can't see anyone from the organizers. Is it okay if we take 15 minutes?
25 minutes.
25 minutes. You're very generous. You're going to regret it. But never mind. We have 25 minutes for discussion. Unbelievable. But we do have it. All right. And there is a mic. And please, those of you who don't want to share with us the Q&A, please leave now. And we can start. There's a gentleman there who raises his hand on the 9th row. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks very much for all three of you. Wonderful.
Please, we want to hear the question or the remark, please.
I wanted to ask all of you, but Norman in particular, and also Ilan, because you spoke about it earlier today, about how academically and in terms of factually we're winning the battle about what has been the history of the 60 years of Nakba. But if we look at the Gazan conflict and we look at the behaviour not just of the US and the silence of Obama was silent at the beginning of the assault on Gaza, or he said a few words, and he was completely silent when Israel murdered 225 people in 10 minutes on the first day. Here in Europe, we had very, very mild admonishments from people like David Miliband about disproportionality that was always prefaced by the terrible inhumanity of bombs on Sderot from Hamas. How do you see this situation changing? Because to many of us here in the UK and the rest of Europe, governments in Europe are still treating Israel as the state, the legitimate state that is defending itself against a small terrorist organisation, and yet we know that that isn't the case. We know that the truth is very, very much different, but we still have governments throughout the EU talking publicly as if that were the case. In fact, more so, Louis Michel, the EU Commissioner, Social Affairs Commissioner, walked into, I think he was in Gaza, and actually blamed Hamas for the fact that Israeli soldiers were lining up children in front of their parents and shooting them. Yeah. So how
I think the point is clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take several points. Thank you very much. Next to you, it's easy. Yeah. You have two, Mike. Okay, so I don't tend to look to the right, but I'll try. Yes. Okay.
I've got a question for Norman. You talked about the decision by Israel not to reposition the UNF forces on their side of the border. It's been claimed a number of times that the reason why they didn't do that was because there was some kind of pro-communist bias in the UNF forces, and if we allowed the UN forces on the Israeli side of the border, then it might put Israel's security in danger, because apparently there were some communist elements within the forces. Not my claim, the claim of other people. So do you have any information if that was true or not, or if what countries were the forces from that could have potentially been pro-Soviet?
Okay, I think the question is clear. Thank you. Yes, there, please. We'll take 5 questions. Is that okay with you all? And then we'll go to the other round. Yes, please.
This is a question for Saleh, Abdel-Jawad, and possibly Isabelle. I first did my research on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon in the 1970s, believe it or not. And I went to the research center before it was closed down. And I noticed you made a reference to it. I've never been able to find out what happened to the archives there. But I also wanted to say that I was very struck in my interviews, oral interviews with Palestinians in Lebanon at that time, that unlike the situation in the occupied territories, the big problem was for anybody, whether they were Christian, Muslim, whether they were living in the camps, whether they'd made it into Beirut, whatever their level of education, was that they were afraid to admit that they were Palestinian, full stop. And I don't think it's changed that much in Lebanon. But I wondered if you had some comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Here. We'll take this and another question, and then we'll let you answer the first round.
So my question is for Professor Abdel-Jawad. You mentioned during your presentation that there are a few Arab historians outside of the Palestinian community that do work on the Nakba. Am I correct?
Arab historians who are not Palestinians.
Yeah.
So there are a few Arab historians who are not Palestinian that study the Nakba. What impact does that have on the way the Arab world sees the Palestinian struggle today, and how it views the Nakba historically and its impact on today's struggle?
Great. And the last, okay, well, you want to go, and that's the last, and then you will be able to answer.
Thank you. I want to ask you how we can challenge these myths a bit more grounded here in this country. I don't know if you're aware, there is a recent proposal at least to redefine extremism in this country, including the defense of the right to armed resistance, which would label you as an extremist. So my question is, how do we challenge these myths over here when defending the principle of armed resistance or doing pro-Palestine activism also labels us as extremists, Muslim extremists, even for those of us who are of kind of atheist allegiances?
All right. Isabelle, you want to go first? Okay. And then Saleh, and then Norman, and then if this time we'll take more questions. Please.
Okay, well, I just want to quickly say about the thing about admitting you're Palestinian. Obviously, it's in a different context for Palestinians inside Israel, but I had a lot of interesting discussions and frustrated people with the whole idea of terminology, because of course outside, and if I wrote any articles that were being published outside, I used to have fights for ages with people who wanted me to write Israeli Arab, and that was a term that was used. So a lot of the time people didn't want to use Palestinian, and then I would think something to start with, and then actually after I knew them longer, they would start using the term Palestinian, and I had misjudged what the problems were to start with. So it was, if I'd have just met them once for an hour and done a certain kind of interview, I never would have begun to understand those kind of problems about admitting, saying, or what do you identify with, what label. So, I mean, obviously completely different context from Lebanon, but that a lot of the people that I talked to at first were using some kind of equivalent of Israeli Arab, or saying that they were displaced, not talking about refugees, and these were sort of words that came later. With some people, and some people it didn't, but that was certainly something that a level of fear meant that I chose an option of staying longer in the community and working part-time. And I know that had I gone in that first year, a lot of the ideas that I had about what people thought, by the end I had completely different ideas about what people were saying and what they were meaning. So in a different context.
Thank you. Saleh, would you like to?
Yes. About this question.
About the questions that you were asked. You can say something about this question as well, and about what Norman said, about anything you want. And you don't have to talk if you don't want to.
Okay. Now, about that refugees were afraid even to declare that they were Palestinians. I mean, this was especially on the late 60s and early 70s normal. What happened in 1947 was, I mean, Israel, from the Israeli part and from the international community, an act which led to the unmaking of Palestine, actually. And what happened, it was followed completely by other states. I mean, especially in Jordan, a complete erase of the name. Palestine no longer exists at all. And even you were unable to declare your Palestinianity. So it was a general. Now, the fear was not only in declaring. Actually, it's interesting to see that, for example, when I mentioned the first book, which academic attempt about from the refugees in Lebanon, which is Nafid Nazal book, Nafid Nazal was unable to record at all. The people don't, the interviews. He just write it later because the people are afraid. And this is still until today a problem with when we recorded the testimonies. Some of the refugees refused. And to add to this, when my PhD, I did my PhD in 1948 about Fatah, none of the leaders or cadres or members of Fatah accepted to be recorded. So I mean, this is part of, yeah. Sorry, there was, I think, another question about Arab historians, the situation. I think even Palestinian historians have more loose, let's say, situation, and I think they are more concerned. Now, we have to take in consideration there are at least 250 books and literature by Arab, not historians, mainly political scientists, intellectuals, about the 1948 war. And as a matter of fact, the first book about the Nakba was Constantin Zrek, who is Lebanese. However, all these books, without, I mean, an exception, except in the last 10 years, we have recently books about, a Syrian book about Jaysh al-Inqadh in Syria, Ibrahim Shakib, the Egyptian narrative about the war. Haikal wrote a book with mainly documents, but all the other, let's say, 200 books is mainly concerning deception, ideology. It doesn't deal with the facts, with the reasons. It doesn't have empirical. We have to understand, until today, none of the Arab regime's archives are open. Even after 60 years, the archives in Egypt, Syria, Jordan still and remain closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Norman, please. He has a mic. He has
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you.
Otherwise.
PhD in 1984, not 1948.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, I was not born.
He did
I
too.
was not born in 19.
Okay. Norman, please.
Just quickly on the second question, the Israeli government had praised the UNEF for having calmed the Egyptian-Israeli border after 1957. And logic tells you that that explanation, that it was infiltrated with communists, it's an illogical explanation. Because if the UNEF had prevented a war on the Egyptian side of the border, then why wouldn't it have prevented a war if it were on the Israeli side of the border? If it were infiltrated with communists on the Israeli side, then it would also have been infiltrated on the Egyptian side, and it wouldn't have prevented a war. So that's sort of the explanation, though you do get explanations like that from the Israelis and their apologists, but it doesn't make any sense when you reflect on it logically. The other question was, who's winning the battle for public opinion? And I agreed with Ilan's comment this morning, but then the issue is raised, if that's true, then how do you account for the behavior or conduct of governments during, say, the Gaza massacre? And the answer, I think, is fairly straightforward, which is it takes political organization to translate popular feeling into a political force, and that hasn't yet been done. But there's no question, if you look at the poll data over a significant period of time, that Israel's standing is sort of like where the American stock market is. In the last BBC World Poll, Israel used to rank rock bottom. Now it hovers in the same range as Iran and Pakistan. But you have to bear in mind there's a huge difference, because Iran and Pakistan get very different media coverage in the West than Israel does. But Israel is still rock bottom with them. Of the 21 countries for which opinions of Israel were polled, 19 of the 21 had a larger negative rating than positive rating for Israel. The only two countries which had a positive rating which was higher than a negative rating were Russia and the United States. And in that regard, Israel's was the lowest standing in the BBC poll. Or you take all sorts of polls like, which is the country in the world you would least like to go for vacation? Of 36 countries, Israel's rock bottom. Which is the country in which the population is most obnoxious to tourists? Israel is number one there. You know? So there's no question about a change in public opinion. The problem is it's very difficult. It takes work to translate it into a political force. I'll just end with an interesting observation. I was talking to a German friend of mine, a former co-author of mine, and she was commenting about this huge chasm that's opened up in Germany, where public opinion is now getting more and more hostile to Israel, whereas Merkel is a kind of lunatic, you know. She thinks she's the last anti-Nazi on God's earth. And my friend said, you know, it's a very serious development, because people are going to begin to wonder if we're all against what Israel is doing, but the German government is waving high the Israeli flag, people are going to start whispering, who controls German foreign policy? No, but then things can really start to get ugly, and all the claims about a resurgence of anti-Semitism, then they can become very real. Right now, I think they're mostly fraudulent. but they could become very real because of this huge disparity that's opening up between public opinion in Europe on the one hand and what the governments are saying on the other hand.
Thank you. Saleh wanted to come back on something. Saleh,
Yeah, it's about the nuclear Iran. I mean, I follow most of what's written in the Western media, and I remembered when the West, wanted to attack Iraq because of Saddam. The main reason, even the question of weapon of mass destruction, that Saddam is a dangerous person and he can use these arms. It's not the problem in the mass, in the weapons, it's themselves. But the fact that these weapons are in the hand of a, let's say, crazy person. And interesting that the Western media never mentioned that in 1973, there was a possibility that Israel will use the nuclear option. When the Egyptians on the third day crossed the canal, and it was not at all to destroy Israel. The Israelis even understood that the Egyptians want only to get in for 30 or only 40 kilometers to move the peace process. However, the whole area went to the edge of a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, this question of the Israelis, the craziness of Israel today, is a part of, I think it's a sign of weakness. We have to understand. It's not really, it's dangerous. This is what I wrote in an article. Israel today as a wounded tiger, exactly. And as you know, every hunter knows a wounded tiger is more dangerous. He's weak, but he's more dangerous. And this is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. We can take three more. Take three more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have some comment from Finkelstein on, on the role of United Nations leadership. When we talk about the political leadership making any comments about the recent Gaza war, they did not say anything when there was a war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now even we have Ban Ki-moon. We haven't had any potent comments from them against that, or in that case, Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have the energy to go upstairs there, or?
He's young.
He's young. Yeah, he's young. You're right. He's young.
He wasn't born in 48.
Yeah, there, the back. Okay.
I would like to ask about the trinity between border, population, and land, which were the themes of this session and the previous session. Ilan Pappe talked in the last session about Israel not taking into consideration, they wanted to take the land, and Finkelstein talked about the miraculous chance to fix the border. I would like to take some clarification. Were in the population part of the Israeli considerations in 1967? Thank you.
I didn't hear the last part. What
was the border thing consideration in Israeli policy in 67? Population or border? Both, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Population. So. Gilbert. Okay. Well, so tell him which one. Yeah. Gilbert. Okay. And
yes,
then we'll finish.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the three of you for the wonderful presentations. And my comment is more a compliment than anything in contradiction with what has been said, and it refers to 67 and Norman's presentation. Well, I fully agree with everything he said, but I think there is another dimension which should be emphasized, which actually is confirmed by Segev's book, where one can really see that the United States gave a green light for the 67 aggression, which is the US agenda. I mean, there is an Israeli agenda, of course, and you defined it, but there was also an American agenda, which was the overthrow of the two most radical anti-American regimes in the region, which were Nasser's Egypt and the Syrian regime. And the same goes actually for the rest. I mean, even if we talk about 2006, for instance, of course you're right, there is this Israeli agenda of deterrence, but there is also the American agenda. In 2006, it's very clear, the green light given by the Bush administration to Israel for the twin wars against Gaza and Lebanon as part of, you know, the anti-Iran strategy of Washington. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think unfortunately, it's already 25 minutes, so Norman, do you want to start? And Saleh,
okay, let me quickly. The first question is actually not so easy to answer, the role of the UN. The role of the UN, it actually has what you would have to say in this case, it has two faces. I'm not saying it's two-faced, but it has two faces. And it's important to keep in mind those two faces. Time won't allow me to elaborate it. I'm just going to state it. There is a kind of legal judicial face to the United Nations, and there's a political face to the United Nations. The legal judicial face of the United Nations happens to be very good when it comes to the application of international law at the legal judicial level, whether it's expressed in United Nations resolutions or whether it takes the form of the opinions of the International Court of Justice. They are pretty scrupulous, the Europeans in particular, and all of the resolutions and the advisory opinion of the United Nations, there have been a complete defeat for the Israelis and a complete vindication of the Palestinian claims. That's the legal judicial face, but then there's the political face which arises in crises. And in the political face of the UN has been, and the Europeans in particular, has been resoundingly bad. And then the challenge is to force the Europeans to abide by what they themselves acknowledge to be the legal judicial principles for resolving the conflict. That is, again, turning those legal judicial principles into a political force. When, you know, they go over there and they say that, well, Hamas has to stop smuggling weapons, well, our answer should be, but I think the International Court of Justice said that the wall has to be dismantled. So since we're talking about enforcing the law, how about enforcing that law also? And forcing them to also abide by their legal judicial rulings. On the question that Gilbert raised, yes, it's impossible to ignore the U.S. side of the equation, and the U.S. side was remarkably candid. On June 4th, just before Israel attacked, the National Security Advisor to Johnson, a guy named Walt Rostow, he said, everything in the Middle East looks good. Arab socialism is dying. Our regimes, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they're doing fine. The only thing we need now, said Rostow, is we need to, and this is his exact words, we need to cut Nasser down to size. That's all we need. And that's, of course, exactly what Israel did in June 1967, and why Israel then became, as it came to be called, the strategic asset of the United States. It, in effect, decapitated Arab nationalism, and it did a very effective job of doing so. You know, at that time, Egypt was a major power. Now it's negligible power in the Arab world except as a surrogate of US influence. And it's interesting, the day after the war began in June '67, Rostow's comment was, he writes a note to Johnson, and he says, quote, "The turkey shoot has begun." They knew exactly what was going to happen, that Israel would wipe them off the map, which is what they did.
We didn't talk much about sources, but we talked about many other things. So let me just finish by telling you an anecdote, which I think sort of summarizes the question of sources, and with this we'll end the session, I think. In 1936, just before, was it 37 rather, before the arrival of the Peel Commission, the head of the educational department in the Jewish agency, someone called Ben-Zion Dinur, who later was the first Israeli Minister of Education, met David Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion asked him what is on his agenda as a researcher, because he was a very famous historian as well. And Dinur said, "I'm very glad that you're asking, because I want some budget. We want to start a huge project that would take us about 10, 15 years to find out whether there was continuation of Jewish presence in Palestine ever since the Roman times until the arrival of the first Zionists in the late 19th century. So Ben-Gurion told him the following. He said, "In 2 weeks' time, the Peel Commission is coming. So if you can reach the conclusion that there was a continuation of Jewish presence in Palestine ever since the Roman exile to the arrival of the first Zionists, I will give you money for the next 10 years to prove the point." I want to thank everyone for a wonderful panel, and thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.